Dr. Aimee Loiselle is an award-winning historian at Central Connecticut State University who studies the modern United States with an interest in women workers, gender, race, and migration. She taught for many years in 9 through 12 public education and adult basic education before completing her PhD in history.
Thank you so much, Gil, for organizing this. I really appreciate being invited, and I really also want to thank the bookstore for creating the space and support for all the authors, and the media folks for putting together such great videos that then go up. My press is very happy to hear that there will be a video going up about this. And I also really need to thank the history department, which has been very supportive of my finishing this book project and getting through the final phases of it. Part of the final phases of publication for this were a lot of, included a lot of images, which as scholars, we track down the licensing and the copyright and the contract and get all of that done. And I couldn't have done that without the support of Mark Jones and Robert Wolf, and also Brenda Lopez in the grants department. They made this book possible in the form that it currently is. Speaking of visuals, I do have handouts if people, it's a very visual book, with the movie, so I made handouts if folks want to take a look at those. So this book, I also like to acknowledge that this book rests on and builds on the work of previous feminist and women's labor historians who have made the way for these stories. Without those women scholars, books like this wouldn't be possible. They really are the ones that carved out places in labor studies and in modern U.S. history to include working women, and particularly Alice Kessler Harris, Blanca Silvestrini, and Jacqueline Jones. And I'm honored at the University of North Carolina Press to be joining the Gender and American Culture series, and the support that they gave so that I could join scholars that I really respected, like Elizabeth Fox Genovese within the Plantation Household and Annalise Orlick's Common Sense and a Little Fire, which were both books that were really pivotal to my interest in working women. With that, we would turn to the first image, and that is that my book centers the 1979 film Norma Rae to demonstrate how the larger society, through capitalist means of cultural production, and that's a really important part of the book, is that I'm not really only looking at these as cultural imagery, but as products of a very capitalist, industrial, cultural system. And that through this cultural system, it appropriates and then erases the histories of diverse women workers, reconstructs narratives of labor that are infused with the notion of an American working class that is white, native-born, and industrial, and usually male. And lastly, creates hyper-individualist images and narratives that fuel the neoliberal political economy, particularly with the neoliberal cultural turn of the 1980s and 1990s. So the book is really a call to try to study pop culture as both the capitalist production with finance and property as embedded in that system. As we all know, as people that do writing, intellectual property and copyright are very powerful capitalist tools that often aren't studied that way by cultural scholars, as well as the creativity and narrative. So that what we're seeing is that there's a business of culture and the imaginative creative process, and how these are run through with gender, race, class, and status. So as part of this call, the book rests on the premise that popular media representations of the working class must be placed in an appropriate and rich historical context to understand how the social categories and financial mechanisms function, and how, when they function, they marginalize those contributors without capital, like Crystal Lee, who the movie was based on, and most people don't know about because they changed the title to get rid of her, and how if these folks without capital especially are marginalized if they have alternative ideas. Like, she really didn't like the depiction in the movie, so they were like, let's get rid of that. And how it also produces gendered and racialized narratives, not through necessarily overt racist decisions, but through decisions around getting investors, marketing, what's going to sell to a studio, and that so that when we look at this historical analysis, it exposes why even directors like Martin Ritt, who made this movie and really viewed himself as a liberal humanist telling poor working people's stories, how even someone like him marginalizes an actual working woman like Crystal Lee, and then, goes on to make millions of dollars with a very racialized and very individualized story of the working class. So if you flip to the next page that has the images, these are the women that I start with. So I start in the book starts with a very wide lens. And a lot of people ask me, why didn't you just jump to talking about the movie? And I didn't want to perpetuate the erasures of the movie. So the movie erases all of these women and their stories. And so I start with a very wide lens to talk about Southern mill hands and Puerto Rican needleworkers who are often not studied together because of history's tendency towards kind of geographic specializations, which has served the field, but I think is really starting to become something more scholars are comfortable with transnational and transcultural histories that aren't bound by what are really constructed national borders, right? That aren't actually what most working people who are migrating for work see as the limits. So starting with this, though, I also do want to acknowledge it's not because I'm arguing that Puerto Rico is a rightful part of the United States. Puerto Rico was occupied and was taken as a colony. But we need to acknowledge that in the 20th century, it has been used as a colonial source of labor, often with exempted minimum wages, exempted tax policies, and other types of exploitative colonial practices. So I'm not arguing that Puerto Rico is part of the United States. I'm just arguing that the United States has used Puerto Rico as a colony. And so I want to acknowledge work by Puerto Rican studies historians like Blanca Silvestrini, Alta Garcia Ortiz, Carmen Whalen, and Emma Amador, who really focus on Puerto Rican women and Puerto Rican women's experiences in U.S. empire. So it's really important to understand that the folks that create these labor markets don't want us to see Southern mill hands and Puerto Rican needleworkers related either. So the people that create the labor markets intentionally fragment the markets by gender, race, and citizenship status because it allows them to exploit the labor markets, to pit the labor markets against each other, and that this was an overt decision starting around 1900. Many manufacturers in the metropole, once they realized that there were skilled Puerto Rican needleworkers on the islands, were like, oh, we can go down there and without advertising it, right? It's never advertised that they're going to do this. We can go down there and start outsourcing because there are already women down there that are skilled workers. And so I also really want to challenge the narrative that manufacturing went from the north to the south to the global south. That really the South and Puerto Rico, the global South, at the same time were integrated into the U.S. industry and drove the 20th century U.S. global ambitions. Textiles and apparel were a core part of U.S. empire all over the world, Central America, East Asia, the Caribbean, parts of Africa. Now we know South Asia. So we really need to see textiles and apparels not as like just feminized labor, but as a critical part of U.S. industrial empire. So I argue that starting at the turn of the 20th century, U.S. and insular government offices and textile and garment businesses incorporated these women in distinct yet interrelated ways. So the women are not equivalents, and I always make that clear in the book. Like, I'm not saying they're equivalents, but they're interconnected. And during the Great Depression, when the markets crash in the South, Puerto Rican women lose wages, piece rates, and work because a lot of mainland companies are like, oh, wait a minute, like now the South is cheaper than Puerto Rico because we don't have shipping costs. And so these, as far as like the unions and the corporations are concerned, these are interrelated. It's the kind of the public that doesn't know that these are interrelated. I call it a fluctuating catalog of labor. The unions were also aware of this, and the International Ladies Garment Workers Union was especially active from Canada down to Puerto Rico. They had organizing in Puerto Rico very active by the 1920s that really expanded in the 1930s. And then, of course, the working women are aware of all these options through informal networks, letter writing. They learned there's better jobs here, their wages are higher in New York City, there are better jobs in Connecticut and Willimantic and Bridgeport, or Holyoke is opening jobs for Puerto Rican workers. That through these words of mouth, they are navigating. And so for Puerto Rican women in particular, industrialization is not a single factory in one place the way it often is portrayed for like male steel workers or male coal miners. For Puerto Rican women, industrialization was pathways through large sprawling networks that reached all the way up to, Springfield and Holyoke, Massachusetts. Then if you flip the book, in the book I focus on these two women as kind of representative workers. So Gloria Maldonado was an International Ladies Garment Workers Union worker, education director and organizer, and she's on the left there leading a bilingual class in New York City. And then on the next page you see Krista Lee Jordan, who is part of the Textile Workers Union of America. Now, we know Krista Lee because she ends up becoming an inspiration in some mainstream media storytelling. But Gloria Maldonado actually had much more labor activism, much more involvement in her union. And both women, though, and the book starts with their quotes, both women understand that the cultural terrain is very important as worker organizing. They both basically say, we need our stories to get out. We want our stories told the way we want our stories told. And this is in the 1970s from women who are, not college educated, haven't been trained in literary studies, but they just understand that people won't take them seriously and they won't be seen if they can't tell their own stories. So Gloria Maldonado participates in a public history a public history project that creates a variety of public representations of Puerto Rican needleworkers in New York City. That, of course, cannot compete at any level with like a massive Hollywood movie. I won't have time to get into her story as much because I'm going to focus a little bit more on the core of the book, which is the appropriation of Krista Lee's story and how she tried to fight it. And so if you flip to the next page, part of the argument is that there was this popular fascination with poor white Southerners in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. There were just an explosion of like television and movies about poor white people. Also in the news, a lot of stories about like Vista and the Appalachian workers, and Lyndon Johnson was really promoting that his welfare policies were not just for people of color in cities, they were also for poor white people in poor rural areas. So there was a lot of discussion, and you see here like the Real McCoys and the Beverly Hillbillies. Paul Newman played a variety of poor white dudes, always looking good, and a little sweaty with the tank tops. These were pervasive, and so it's not that just that Krista Lee is this captivating woman. It's that the person that starts researching Southern mill hands and the strike that was going on and the waves of organizing that were going on in the 60s and 70s thought, oh, like this article will sell. Like I'll be able to sell this piece because he's a freelance writer. He's not doing this out of charity. He wants to sell a big article. And what's also going on in the 1970s is, as you can see here, this is mostly male-focused, but in the 70s, we have the interest in women's liberation. Women's liberation starts reaching also into the mainstream. The Phil Donahue Show, television news, the Dick Cavett Show starts having feminists on, so it suddenly starts to become more marketable to have women heroines. So it's like, oh my God, we can take, this Southern fascination, this interest in women's liberation and women's stories, and we can make like a marketable article out of it. And so you can flip the first piece of marketable mainstream was this freelance writer, Hank Lieferman, sold a very large piece to the New York Times Magazine. He was a freelance journalist in Atlanta. He became interested in this because he was in the South. And he saw Krista Lee as one of the people he interviewed and was like, she's good. Like, she's attractive, she's married, she's got 3 children, she's a talker, she's very willing. She's very normative in that she's a white mill hand in a white mill hand family, married with children, but she was willing to push a little bit against gender norms and really speak out, which was she was slandered for doing that. People made up stories about her, which plays into later her reaction to the Norma Rae script. People called her, whore, slut, troublemaker. There were rumors about her. And she always said, hey, I was open about the fact that I've been married and divorced and had a kid out of wedlock. That other stuff is not true. So it's not like she tried to portray herself as a saintly angel, but she just really understood without the scholarly language that gender was being used against her to try to make her not be active in the labor movement. That article then caught the attention of Ms. Magazine, which is just starting in 1973 and deciding in 1974 that it wants to expand into doing some TV documentaries. And the first documentary is like a 5-segment show for PBS, and they picked Crystal Lee as one of their segments. And it was the most popular segment in their focus groups. I found it fascinating how much, even back in 73, 74, PBS and Ms. focus grouped this to death before they, I went through the files. I was like, oh my God, they did focus groups all over the country. They rearranged the order of the documentary, putting Crystal Lee last because she was so popular. They wanted people to see her as the final part of the show. And Gloria Steinem, as you can see, had her come up to New York, and she was really celebrated. But again, even in this, in the documentary, Crystal Lee's like, it's not just me. I actually joined this labor drive 10 years into it. There were black workers who were doing this much earlier than me, and there were many more people who were already fired for organizing when I got in. But they portray it in the documentary and later in the movie as if she started the union drive, which she always had a problem with. She was like, that is not what happened. But that doesn't make a good underdog story to say, hey, there were other workers doing it first. And then the biography that the New York Times writer was able to get a contract for, and then that's what the Hollywood producers, when you flip, you can see the producers on the left, the screenwriters on the upper right, and the director and Sally Field on the bottom. So these are the Hollywood professionals that then took all this material, offered Crystal Lee nothing. They said, we're not going to pay you, but they did send her the Crystal Lee script. It was originally called Crystal Lee, and they sent her the script, but it was really the personal melodrama of one poor white woman. And they actually went to 20th Century Fox and said, oh, I think these are a little out of order. Oh, and said, this is based on Rocky, the Rocky story, which is further along in the slides because I'm cutting out a section of the talk, but and that Rocky was this underdog, poor white man, and that this was going to be a female version of that. And that's where this idea of women's liberation comes in, that these women producers were going to make this story of a woman worker, and that's how they got the funding. And so when Crystal Lee said, I'm not going to give your approval to the script, the producers and Martin Ritt and their attorneys hounded her and her attorney for months to try to get permission from her. They really wanted to be able to say, based on a true story. They wanted to call it Crystal Lee, and they wanted to have her show up at the opening night and wave and talk about what a great movie it was. And she just refused. They did pay Hank Lieferman $35,000 for the film rights to his biography. He tried to get a special release from her, and she did eventually sign something because she didn't fully understand what it was. She did eventually sign something giving him full film rights, but she became very savvy, and this is part of the argument in the book too. This isn't just about the exploitation of a country bumpkin. Once she realized what had happened, she was like, okay, I'm getting a lawyer. I'm not going to sign any more papers without an attorney checking it. And then she eventually does sue 20th Century Fox and gets $80,000 in the first lawsuit, and I think the next lawsuit, it wasn't disclosed. They required she sign a non-disclosure. She didn't even tell her children, because I interviewed them, and they were like, nobody knows how much she got in the second one. So we want to say that after the release of the movie, she does fight it. Like she comes out and she says, I'm the real Norma Rae. You know, there's the movie, and that's great. And Sally Field did a nice job. She never critiqued Sally Field too hard until Sally Field didn't thank the union in her Oscar speech. Then Crystal Lee critiqued her for that. And that's what I mean. For Crystal Lee, it always came back to the union movement. How could Sally Field get up and make a speech thanking Martin Ritt and the studio and the script, writers, and not thank the people that actually made the movie possible, the thousands of workers that had been union organizing, many of them fired and blacklisted from their jobs, and she gets up and acts like this was all the creation of Martin Ritt. But Martin Ritt needed a hit. He was known for these kind of humanistic movies, but his last few had not made a big splash. So he intentionally, and in his papers, he presents it very defensively. Like he sees nothing wrong with this, that she didn't get it, she didn't understand the business, and he didn't want to make a labor movie. He'd made that with the Sean Connery movie about the Molly Maguires, and he said that was a flop, and it was painful, and he was ashamed of that movie and how it had done. And so he wanted to make sure that Norma Rae would not go down that direction. He wanted a heroine, he wanted a love interest, he wanted sexual tension, and he's very explicit about these creative choices as business choices, not as like, this is the creative, manifestation of Crystal Lee's story. This is what's going to sell the movie, and that's what I want. I want to make as much money as possible, or the movie won't get out. So he really makes that decision, and as a result, Crystal Lee is removed. The name is changed. She's portrayed as this singular heroine, which I argue, and there's multiple images of the Norma Rae icon in here, that as the movie is marketed, there is this constant shrinking in on this one image of Sally Field with the sign. So everything is cropped out, right? So the other workers, neighbors, any union events, it just shrinks right down to her. And I actually in the book compare it to the icon that goes from Ernesto Che Guevara, there's this photograph of him at the funeral for the people that were killed in the explosion in the Caribbean, and that gets cropped down to just his face and becomes like the Che icon. And so I say the same thing happens here. It gets cropped down until it's just the Norma Rae icon, and everything else is cut out. And again, this is a creative business decision to make the image more appealing. And you can see in there some various uses of the image from various websites, TV commercials, and the book has many more images and lists of those. And to kind of wrap up the talk part, so the final chapter of the book discusses how, this icon becomes more and more prevalent, and it's still today. Like, I have a list, and you can see the list in there. There's two lists of the Norma Rae icon usage in text media and in television media, and they come right up until last year. So television and movies and websites and social media posts are still using it. One social media post said, Trump is acting all Norma Rae on the January 6th, insurrection. I was like, there's a classic example of what I'm saying. Like, when something that comes out of radical leftist politics and poor working women is extracted up out of the material reality, becomes this free-floating cultural, symbol, and can be applied to like a right-wing populist, refusing to concede democratic electoral politics. That to me captures like that entire final chapter of the book. And I say it's really converges, the Norma Rae icon really converges with this rightward turn. And certain popular folks like Milton Friedman, the right-wing economist, Ronald Reagan, the right-wing politician, and Billy Graham, the right-wing evangelical activist, are very emblematic of this rightward turn in pop culture. They are by no means driving it. The chapter does talk about that they're building on a decades-long movement in the United States through things like the John Birch Society and, you know, the Barry Goldwater campaign, that there's all these other things driving this. But they're just very savvy at this kind of popular narrative of like the individual who's defiant against like those insiders. And we're still living with that, right, that narrative today. Like, we need to, oh, sorry, that's my timer. That we're still living with that narrative today, and that the Norma Rae icon really converges with that well. This idea that if you are an underdog and you are defiant and you make your stand and you refuse to accept that hyper-individualist defiance is part of that rightward turn of that kind of politics and of working class politics in particular. And I just think it's really important to understand. Oh, and at the back you can see pictures of these folks and in their popular images. Again, in the book I say I'm not really getting into the nuances of their economic debates or their political debates. I'm talking about them as public, popular personas. And it's really important to understand that, as I was just saying, the ideas at January 6th and the ideas that we see in current electoral politics about who is the working class, who deserves to be called workers, who are the real working Americans, that those are still thrown around, and that's still very much a powerful narrative. And women of color and low-wage working women are still fighting to be included in that and to still be part of kind of these dominant politics and dominant cultural debates. So thanks, everybody, for coming. And
questions?
How are you doing?
So, great talk. Looks like it's a great book. So you characterize the icon as a neoliberal icon. And I'm wondering if it's neoliberal in the sense not only that it sanitizes who the women were, white women rather than women of color, but also it erases the collectivism that was more popular back in the day when those unions got organized.
Yeah, and what I try to say is like the cropping of it is just like kind of capitalist pop culture, like how can we make something eye-catching and grab people? Then it converges with neoliberalism, and I think part of the reason it converges with the neoliberal turn is because it does wipe out the collective, and I talk about that quite a bit in the book about how Friedman, Reagan, and Graham all very overtly attack the collective. Like they are, you know, unions, government, any kind of big organization, except corporations, they're okay. But any kind of collective working peoples or kind of progressive collective is being basically decimated by their cultural messaging, as well as by the dismantling that Reagan does from, you know, his position as the president and as governor of California. And so I do think that loss of the collective is really important to why it ends up converging and why it ends up being something that you can kind of apply to anything. Because if there was any kind of collective image, and there were many collective images from the movie, and none of those become the icon. This becomes the icon because of that hyper-individualization.
Aimee, I really appreciate your approach to this project, especially the way that you're kind of looking both at that history of the activism and then putting that in conversation with that capitalist pop cultural convention, those conventions that you're looking at. I also really appreciate what you were saying at the beginning of your talk about looking at women workers in the U.S. South and Puerto Rican women workers in conversation with one another. And I wonder if you could expand a little bit on that connection, because I think the breaking down of that border seems really important, both in terms of documenting the history, but also in movements toward, you know, solidarity, toward labor rights and those sorts of things.
Yeah. thanks for asking that question. I didn't focus on that here because it is a very complicated thing to try to do. And I do have to say that was the thing I got the most pushback from more conventional scholars. They were like, isn't this really 2 books? I heard that so many times. And luckily, I was a non-traditional student, so I was old enough to be like, I'm doing it my way. Because I do think it did make me wonder how many times maybe younger scholars that might do something a little bit more innovative get pushed away from that. But a lot of folks questioned whether I should do that. And I found enough documents. And so one of the things that I found was, first of all, I was talking to friends of mine that were Puerto Rican women in Springfield and Holyoke, and I was talking about the project before I started researching Puerto Rican women, and I was like, I'm looking at Southern mill hands in the 60s and 70s and how they're unionizing, blah, blah, and both of them said, our mothers moved to Massachusetts to work in the factories up here. And I'm like, wait a minute, I'm from Massachusetts. Why don't I know this history? Why isn't this part of the story? And so there was an overt personal choice that became a scholarly choice of saying, I'm not going to participate in the segmentation of that, either from a scholarly point of view or, feeding into that kind of labor market mentality that these are different workers. And then I found a 1900 brochure, and it was in the archive of the American textile history at Lowell, which is now closed. And I would say that because it's a sad that we're losing some of these historical archives. And as I was going in, they were packing up the boxes. And I was like, please, tell me, you haven't packed up this stuff yet. And she was like, I'm so happy somebody is here. And then she would look so sad as she went off and boxed up this stuff. I was like, oh my God. And I found in there that in 1900, some South Carolinian businessmen and politicians were like, oh my God, we need to look at the Caribbean, particularly Puerto Rico, for textiles and apparel, because we grow cotton, we ship it up to New York for factories, we're trying to make more factories in the South, and Puerto Rico has all these skilled women workers. And so there I was like, oh, this is nobody can fight me on this piece of evidence. For historians, it's always is it in the archive? And I'm like, here it's in the archive. They're overtly saying this, and they had multiple magazines about going down to Puerto Rico and trying to talk to, there were already contractors there because the Spanish Empire had contracted work there, so the U.S. didn't have to create a contract labor system. It was already there. And so they talk about the contractors and the savings for retailers and manufacturers from the metropole. And so I thought, okay, this is good. So that's actually what starts the first chapter is that. And they created a South Carolina and West Indian cotton cotton event that then they opened up to the north, and they're in their pamphlets, they actually have the whole East Coast down to the Caribbean with ripples from Maine down through the South around the Caribbean. And then it says we are creating an empire not just by military, but by commerce and by textiles and apparel. So that became the launching point. And then I started reading more about the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, and all those organizers fully understood that the New York City labor market was being decimated by the South and Puerto Rico, and that Puerto Rico, and I talk about this in the book, I don't talk about it here too much, but Puerto Rico became the model for the border industrial program along Mexico and the United States, which is in vernacular called the maquiladoras. So it was the consultants from Puerto Rico that went to Mexico and were hired by the U.S. and Mexican government to create that, because they said, we're going to take the colonial exemptions and create a space that is exempted not through colonialism, but through imposition of the nation state, that this area is going to be exempted from our constitutions and federal and national international law. So Puerto Rico becomes the inspiration for that. So governments, managers, and workers and union leaders all understood this, and it just doesn't reach the public. And whenever I teach this to students of Puerto Rican descent in the New England, you know, they grew up hearing the welfare queen narrative, right? That like poor women just came up here to get welfare. And when I tell them the story, they're like, why don't I know this? And I'm like, you tell me. And they're like, oh yeah, what company is going to want to advertise that they go down there for poor women workers and then recruit the poor women workers up here to undercut like the Massachusetts-born workers? No, that's not in any company's PR, right? And so I just really saw it as empowering for them to understand that their mothers and grandmothers were recruited to come here as skilled workers, not as, you know, welfare.
Okay. Now we take one more quick question. Who wants it?
Do you know why the movie's producers chose the name Norma Ray? Like, what was the valence of that as a name, and what were they trying to communicate through, particularly the last name, but also the first name? Yeah,
so in researching that, it was actually the director, Martin Ritt, and the screenwriters. The screenwriters and Martin Ritt worked on multiple scripts based in the South. So they kind of considered themselves experts in like Southern pop representation. So they went through and they changed like J.P. Stevens to O.P. Henley, Crystal Lee Jordan to Norma Ray. All I could see was notes in the script. They never said more than that, but just that their notes in the script would often say things like, make this more dramatic, or this will appeal to audiences. And with the name changes, there was just like this list. And what it seemed to me was, and again, they didn't document any focus groups, although I'm sure they ran it through groups. But it was also just this urgent need because they needed to get insurance, and the insurance wouldn't back the project until they had different names, because they felt Crystal Lee could sue them because she didn't sign any of the releases. So a lot of that, I think, was actually pretty fast, because they were like, if we want that $5 million from 20th Century Fox, we've got to get error and omission insurance, which means we have to change all the names.
Well, thank you very much. That was great.
Thanks, everybody.